And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker tonight. The plan was for me to memorize his accolades, but when I started searching him online, I realized I couldn't remember. So I decided to make a list of his accomplishments thus far. He's pretty well accomplished. So, co-founder and president of Udemy. If you have been watching the news, they just raised $32 million, another round. Growth advisor to Lyft, and he helped launch Lyft LA. He's the co-founder of Growth Hackers Conference, which is another awesome Growth Hackers event. It's a day event. They have it about twice a year. And he's currently the co-founder of Sprig, which is food on delivery, and he'll be talking about that tonight. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Gagan Biyani. Thanks.
So really, I think there's an order of operations that has been popularized by the lean startup, but hasn't sort of really, I think, still has a long way to go before companies truly adopt this order. That I believe is a necessary segmentation of the different stages of a company. And the first part of that is finding product market fit. I think the biggest misconception of most entrepreneurs and sort of early employees really at companies is that their company deserves or is the right idea / deserves to be successful because they, there's a lot of ego driven in the idea of saying, hey, this is my idea, this is what I spent my time on. And the trick early on in startups is to eliminate your ego as much as possible. And so this can be challenging for some, and certainly for me, I almost never hire people who I think have high egos, even if they're ridiculously smart or intelligent, smart or hardworking, because I find that it makes it too difficult to do what is the most challenging thing in a startup, which is recognize where you're wrong. And recognize what is right about your product and what is really people care about and what all the other stuff that nobody gives a shit about that you think they care about but they really don't. And until you've figured that out, you will never be able to grow into a really successful company. There are companies that figure it out on the way. So it does happen on occasion that you grow, and as you grow, you slowly figure out what the perfect product is, and then all of a sudden you start to see, sorry, this is the way in reverse. All of a sudden you start to see sort of the growth take off and the traction that you want. But if you're smart about it, you can short circuit that time frame. And so the thing that's really interesting about having done this now at three, sort of 2.5 different companies, depending on all the different ways you want to count the half, whether that's Lyft or Growth Hackers Conference or a company I started when I was 16. But the thing that I've learned is that actually with a good amount of discipline, you really can short circuit the amount of time it takes to get to product market fit, therefore accelerating the growth of your company and moving you more quickly into the next stages, which frankly are the stages where, it's easier to hire people. You're obviously already past the most difficult point, the most difficult gauntlet of a startup. And that's where really growth matters. The second thing that I think is interesting is once that happens, that's the first phase of discovery of a startup, but actually the second phase is equally as challenging, which is, okay, I've got something some people want. How do I take it from that to something that lots of people want? And that's discovering what the growth strategy is that's going to work. And traditionally speaking, you're not going to have just one growth strategy, but you will have a core sort of style of growth strategy that will work. So what I mean is, there are companies that grow via word of mouth and brand. There are companies that will grow via direct response, paid acquisition, sort of email marketing, etc. And then there are companies that grow via sort of more B2B style sales of getting on the phones and grassroots sort of person-to-person interaction. It's very rare that your company will be successful at all three. And so one of the things you have to do is identify which one of those three is appropriate for your audience, and then figure out more detail, drill down even further, figure out what specific sort of tactics are useful and go from there. So, and then the final thing, and this is the fun part, I've actually never been able to really participate in this. I've seen it happen at Udemy, I've seen it happen at Lyft, but I left both companies before this happened, but it's just, scale. Just pour fuel on the fire, and obviously this is when you see big rounds raised. Oftentimes you may not realize this, but if it's a third or fourth round in a company, like Udemy's $32 million round or Lyft's 60 or sort of $250 million round. In those situations, those growth rounds really only happen if there's some really high likelihood that the company's going to succeed. And remember, high likelihood is still 30%, right? So it's still shitty odds, but it's a lot better than the sort of 5% at the first stage. So when having done this a couple of times, one of the benefits a year and sort of a couple months ago when I started Sprig was that we had all of these lessons from previous companies that we could then throw into this new one, and I'm still relatively hungry and young and able to sort of still interested in just working my ass off and getting this done, and found 3 other co-founders who were kind of in the same range of different ages, but at the same sort of mentality. And one of the things that we did very early on is we eliminated all of our distractions. And what that means is that, look, it's easy to say it's important to find product market fit. But then you go and you launch your first product and you're like, holy shit, nobody's using it. And that's when you really have to make the hard choices of saying, wait a second, rather than cheat, I call it cheating, right? Like cheating on a diet or something like that, right? Rather than cheat and eat pie and cake on Saturday night because you're pissed off that you didn't lose 5 pounds this past week, right? Or in other words, rather than cheat and spend a bunch of money on Facebook ads, even though you haven't actually figured out product market fit, you have to eliminate all of those distractions and stop cheating. And so when we first launched Sprig, remember my whole MO, right, and this is what people knew me as at the time, and certainly how I pitched my team, was I know how to grow companies, and we decided not to do anything growth related for the first 6 months. And actually to this day we haven't, although I assure you very soon we'll start to ramp up our marketing. So yeah, we had a bunch of rules. No advertising. When Sprig launched, there was absolutely no advertising. I think one VC randomly during our Series A process was like, oh yeah, I saw your Facebook ads back in the day. And I was like, oh, when did that happen? I think Morgan, my co-founder, had never used Facebook ads before and wanted to put $150 into Facebook ads. That was the extent of our Facebook ad budget. Okay, I don't even know what the numbers said because I never looked at them. I was like, Morgan, you have fun. And it was on a weekend. The second thing, next slide. Second thing is we didn't discount. Actually, even today, you can't get a free Sprig meal except for the lucky few today who are going to get one because I just bought it for them, right? We don't have promo codes. We have no way of providing people with free Sprig meals. Again, this will change. So everything in this talk is about stage, right? We've graduated to a different stage, so this will all change. But we didn't give any discounts. We sold the product as it was, and this sort of discipline allowed us to ensure that the pricing was right and ensure that the product was the right product that people really wanted. Next. And then we also didn't have any product distractions. So the original product for Sprig, 3 days after my last day at Lyft, so 3 business days. So my last day at Lyft was a Friday, as many last days are. We had a big party, whatever. Saturday and Sunday come around, and the following Wednesday we delivered 40 meals to customers. 3 days after we had started working on Sprig. We had about 2 weeks of sort of setup time where I was working part-time, but we had no engineering, no product. We had a very simple hypothesis. Our hypothesis was that if we have a delivery model which was proprietary, so we don't go into it, but we had this idea that if we use this Lyft-like delivery model and we hired a personal chef to create great meals, that people would be able to get those meals on average in 10 to 20 minutes. That was the sort of core value proposition that we were trying to test in the early days. So we didn't need to build any technology to prove that. We put up an Eventbrite page, and we took, just like you bought tickets to this event, you could have bought a meal on Sprig at the time. It was called Fresh, it's a nickname, but we rebranded. And we emailed out that Eventbrite to about 100, 150 people, just friends and family and sort of that kind of thing, in San Francisco. And you would go on the Eventbrite and you'd pick whatever you wanted, and then, all of a sudden we would then start scrambling. So what we had was this sort of HQ in my living room in my apartment in San Francisco, where we sort of had 3 different devices. We had an iPad to watch the delivery driver, an iPad to be able to look at Google Maps and really very quickly map things out. We had a computer that had Google spreadsheets that basically kept all of the inventory of all of the drivers. So if a driver had 5 chicken, 3 beef, and 2 veggie, and a veggie just got sold, we'd manually change the spreadsheet so that it had 1 veggie left, which you can imagine was a very risky scenario. If something screws up, all of a sudden, one of my friends is shit out of luck on food. But then on top of that, we had another phone essentially that we were using to text message customers. So whenever an order came in, here's the order of operations. Oh, and then we had a physical world thing. We had this map of San Francisco on the coffee table with little pieces of Settlers of Catan pieces, because I happen to have that in my living room. 6 different colors of Settlers of Catan pieces that each referred to our 6 drivers at the time. And any time an order came in, it was, all right, and we're trying to get this order to them in 10 minutes, right? So it's all manual. Order comes in. All right, Neeraj, you send all the text messages. So he'll send, text message to the drivers with the address and the sort of order. Text message to the customer confirming it. At the time they had no idea it was from a personal cell phone number. And then I'd go into the inventory. I'd change the inventory. I'd say this driver. We'd move the Settlers of Catan piece over to the other part of the city. So if he's in North Beach, if the driver's in North Beach, we'd move it over, and they're going over to Alamo Square, we'll move it over to Alamo Square, and then the order will happen. And that was the first version of Sprig. Okay, and the reason why we do all that is because we got that up and running in 3 days, and so we're able to test and understand what product people wanted. And over the next 6 months, we did this another 12 times. So by the time launch date came, we had a high degree of certainty that the product that we built was, and it changed, right? So we didn't do this 12 times, the exact same fucking test. Every time we improved on different things that we thought were lacking. We interviewed the customers who used the product. We interviewed customers who had never heard of the product, which is 99% of San Francisco. And during this time, we were able to come up with a product that we thought people really wanted. So when we finally launched Sprig, it grew entirely via word of mouth. And to this day, there's nobody in this room who has found out about Sprig there's only 2 ways you could have found out about Sprig. Word of mouth, and actually I think that's the next slide. No, keep going. Yeah, go again, and then we're going to go back to that one. There's only 2, this one. There's only 2 ways you could have found out about Sprig. From another person who's used the service, right? 86%, or from press, 14%. That's it. And today it's probably more like 2% from press and 98% from word of mouth, because you only get press articles every once in a while, and we happen to get one the week this survey ran. So the point is that over the last 6 months, we've grown to a company, and actually within 3 months, we grew to a company that raised a $10 million funding round with no growth, no marketing whatsoever. You can't even refer a friend if you wanted to right now. And if you try using the Facebook and Twitter after ordering, it's a complete joke. It doesn't even really work. So the point is, the discipline really counts for something. Now back, if you don't mind. What it counts for is that while you're building the product and you're listening and understanding that your product may not be the right idea, and you're watching the competitors and seeing what they're doing, and you're watching consumer behavior in real life, how they currently, in this case, eat dinner, right? You're able to learn and pick up on a set of things that are really critical, that make an experience that is okay, or an idea that's okay, to something that's magical. And you start to identify the specific characteristics that might make that possible. Also, frankly, you've only got so much time to think. Your brain is actually the biggest constraint on your success. It's much bigger of a constraint than the amount of time you have to work, I think. I always call it attention, as opposed to sort of the amount of hours you have to work. So your attention can only be split so many ways. And if you divide your attention into more things, you're more likely to be less successful at each one of those things. So by forcing the entire team to say no cheating, I eliminated like 90% of the potential ways we could grow. The only way we could grow is by people loving our product. The thing that's amazing is we started to do a lot of things that are unique to Sprig that have really changed customer perception and made it much more likely that people order again. We figured out how to deliver food hot. When we were first delivering, it was all cold food. It was all, you get it, then you microwave it at your home. There's other companies that still do that. And we realized that customers really wanted food that was hot. And so we were hell-bent on that one. That was super hard to do. It took us about 6 weeks of culinary research and operations research and basically the entire team pushed back the launch by 3 or 4 weeks just so we could figure this out. So we figured out how to deliver hot. We figured out the packaging that was necessary. We made the packaging nice. Sort of realized that the dinner experience requires a set of flair. Like, we don't want people to think of this as like delivery pizza, which comes in this like ugly fucking box, and like, you know, the pizza's all over the place and whatnot, or Chinese food. Don't even get me started. They don't even bring you chopsticks half the time. It's like, what's going on? And so what we did on top of that, and then the final thing we did is we also added this little dessert bite. So every Sprig meal comes with a free little chocolate, truffle, or mendiant at the end of your meal. And it was kind of one of those things where when we were talking to customers, a lot of them were like, look, you know, I really need some dessert or some wine after this. Well, we couldn't serve them wine, so we were like, let's figure out how to make them a little bit happy with, at a low enough cost that we could do it for free, so because we're not ready to sort of sell new products. And so that's where the dessert bite came in. A bunch of other touches of the service. You know, we call our servers, our Sprig delivery drivers, Sprig servers, to sort of give you this restaurant flair to it. These are all small touches. Most people don't notice any individual one of these touches, but as a collective, they create a brand identity that has really resonated with people. A lot of that was just sort of core storytelling about how Sprig happened. There's actually a pretty interesting set of science, I think. You know, I set up a framework in the beginning of this talk, but now we'll go deep into the science that I think is, you know, social science. So, you know, you're not going to see a whole lot of numbers here, but social science that I think really explains how I think, and the rest of the Sprig team think about these types of problems. And it's really a very simple marketing funnel, or I like to think of it more like a life cycle. And it's about looking at the customer from 4 different angles. Before they buy, aka before they've ever heard of your product or ever used it in the past. The first purchase, the first experience they have with your product. For a paid product, I call it a purchase, obviously, right? For a free product, it can't just be registration. So with Facebook and Twitter, registering does not count here, okay? Here is that moment at which someone understands what Facebook and Twitter are. So at Twitter, it was like following 6 people, I think, right? If you followed 6 or 7 Twitter handles, all of a sudden you understood what Twitter was. And you are far more likely, there was a step function increase in the likelihood that you were to actually use the product again. So whatever that aha moment is, deliver that aha moment. Then it's them using it again and again. And then finally them sharing with friends. And so when you start to think about how people react to products, right? This is all about growth now, by the way. When you start to think about how people react to products, this is sort of what's going on in their heads during this time, okay? And so, you know, classic, I hate change. You know, most people will not want to try your product, right? Like, that's just the way the world works. This is happens to be a very select group of people, as you all know, in startups who are somewhat willing to try other people's products, although honestly, I'm a terrible early adopter for most things, so. And I'm sure many of you selectively adopt things, right? You don't adopt everything that's going to be useful for you. Then it's like, okay, understanding, figuring out what this is. Then it's like, okay, I tried this service once, it's great, maybe I should try it again. And then finally, like, I'm hooked. I want to use it again and again, for sure. There are obviously companies out there for which this life cycle looks somewhat different, but I can say that I think the overall philosophy that I'm providing to you should be applicable to almost any company, B2B, B2C, anything. Next slide. So what this is acquisition, conversion, retention, referral. You guys all probably generally heard of this. I'm not going to go too deep into it. But the basic crux of this is that if you understand this funnel, then you can ask questions during the customer development process and during the growth discovery process that will allow you to identify what type of marketing is appropriate. So what you do is you literally sit down with customers and you ask them, what did you think about Sprig before, what did you do for dinner before you ever had Sprig, right? You ask them in this stage, and you ask them a set of questions associated with that. What did you do for dinner? Where do you go for food? What are the different things that you read and watch during your daily life that are related to food in any way? Or, you know, and what you're doing essentially is running a panel of questions that will give you more and more information about what your customer is thinking at the time that they are about pre-purchase. Then you do the same thing during purchase. What was it about Sprig that made you decide to use it the first time? What happened in your life? Were you at the gym? Was that a big thing for you? Were you, and I won't ask them, were you at the gym? I'll just ask them, where were you? And they'll tell me, but for the sake of this conversation, I'm going to I'm going to fill in the answers a little bit. But, so, what sort of, did you, what sparked your, when you're at the gym, how did you remember us, Did you hear about it from a friend? What did your friend say to describe it, right? Those kinds of things. Retention, why do you use it again? What is the core value proposition? And then referral, which is why did you tell your friends about it? At what point did you start to tell your friends? And at what point did you, and what do you say, how do you describe that? So, when I first joined Lyft, and this is true of almost every sort of hardcore, data-driven organization out there. Actually, Lyft's a brand-driven organization. It's very different from data-driven. I interviewed a guy. We're interviewing for a head of growth position right now. So if anyone here is interested, you should certainly check it out. I interviewed a guy this morning who came from gaming, and in the gaming world or in the sort of like Groupon living social world of these or e-commerce companies, these hardcore data-driven performance marketers, the one thing they never do is they never talk to their customers. They just never ask them any questions at all. And the problem with that is, and it works to some extent, right? Gaming companies are some of the most successful marketers in the world. I mean, you can't deny their success. They're amazing. But the reason that works is because they have so much data, right? They have so many users, and millions of users, that like they can afford to run 1,000 tests in 2 weeks of different ad copy that's completely generated by a computer, right? And then figure out which ad copy works, and then deliver it to the customer, and that'll work pretty well. Most of us, peons over here with a few thousand users a day or whatever, like we don't have the luxury of that kind of testing, and so asking your customers gets you closer to a more perfect starting point from which you can then do those tests, right? So instead of testing 1,000 keywords or 1,000 messages, you're testing 5, right? And of those 5, you're actually pretty confident about 2 of them. So when I joined Lyft, I had 2 jobs at Lyft, sort of split that 6 months into 2 3-month periods. And the first 3 months was all about driver acquisition. It was about getting more drivers on the road at Lyft. And if you were here a year and a half ago, or you were my friend at that time, you gave me a lot of shit because it took us a long time to figure that problem out. Still a challenge, but And then the second phase, which is what I'll talk about, and I think it's next slide now, Gabriel. They're super open-ended, right? Tell me about your daily life. What do you read? Where do you go? When do you not work at home? What do you do when you're not at home? These are examples of things that are so open-ended, you're really just listening. You're just trying to hear what they're saying. And then through about 5 to 10 of these conversations, you end up getting further. And so when I joined Lyft, first 3 months, supply in San Francisco. Second 3 months, we launched in LA. And this was the first market outside of San Francisco we had ever launched. Next slide. The thing about Lyft LA that was interesting was that people in LA have a very different taxi experience or transportation experience than people in San Francisco. A lot of people honestly back then didn't even think it was going to work in LA. Like, I would talk to sort of VCs or startup people, probably an audience that demographically looks very similar to this audience, and a good majority of the people were like, this is just a rich San Francisco thing, right? Lyft and Uber and those kinds of things. Certainly not the case, obviously, based on the traction recently, but the thing that was interesting was when I was interviewing people in LA, they had a very different perspective on what made them really excited about Lyft. In San Francisco, the way that you catch a cab is you walk outside and you put your hand up, right? And Travis Kalanick is the one who sort of started explaining this way, but it's very simple. You put your hand up, and that hasn't changed for 50 years, right? But in San Francisco, the likelihood that you'll actually get a cab is pretty high. You'll find a cab on the street, it'll happen, right? Except for New Year's Eve. But if you are in LA, it's too spread out. And so the lesson that I learned by interviewing people was actually, they don't do that. They pick up the phone. And by picking up the phone, what happens a lot of times, as you guys may know if you've ever been in another city and like me, traveled a lot and woken up at 5 a.m. to get a cab, and you're rushing out the door and, oh shit, there goes the taxi. They left. They didn't fucking call. They didn't care that I was like literally 2 minutes late. The taxi just disappears. Biggest problem with people in LA was reliability. So the way we got them to try Lyft was to tell them it was cheaper than a taxi because it's hard to message reliability in the app. But the way we got them to convert and actually use it for the first time was, hey, once you use this, your car will be on its way, and it's going to show up, right? And then we knew that the thing that kept people staying with Lyft here in San Francisco, and the reason why Lyft had beaten Sidecar, right? The reason why people may not remember this. How many people remember Sidecar? So, the thing that's funny about this is that when I joined Lyft, I actually applied to Sidecar first because I thought they were going to win. A lot of people did. And the lesson that Lyft had out of this entire sort of experience, one of the lessons, certainly there's a whole bunch of other things, the pink mustache, etc., right? But one of the lessons was that if you have drivers that people like, it's going to be a much more memorable experience for customers. They're more likely to share it with their friends. So it's not a core sort of visceral value proposition. It's not the type of thing where you say, hey, you're going to have nicer drivers. Great, sign me up. It's the type of thing that you get this feeling from this brand. It's like the chocolate, right? It's like nobody's going to buy Sprig for the chocolate. And that's a ridiculous proposition, right? Like it costs like 50 cents to get a piece of chocolate. It costs $12 to get Sprig. Like it's not good enough. But people remember the chocolate. They actually remember the chocolate sometimes more than they remember the meal, right? And the same thing was true with the drivers. People remembered their great experience with drivers. And so what we did in Lyft LA was we put out an ad at all the acting and modeling agencies in LA, and the comedian agencies and all these places, all these schools, and said, hey, if you're looking for part-time work, come drive for Lyft. So the first 100 drivers in LA, like 50 to 70% were these like young, attractive, very sociable actors and models and comedians, just funny people all around. And so your first set of experiences in LA is a bit more party, a little bit more, it's a different vibe down there than up here. And so that contributed to the retention and sort of got people using our service more and more. And then, I had nothing to do with this last part, but John Zimmer, this co-founder at Lyft, when he was doing the same type of customer development for Lyft that we were doing for Sprig, he identified a couple of core points in this ride-sharing customer experience that were broken, right? If a shady car, like think about Sidecar, right? Actually, I'm sure, he won't ever admit this to me, and this is just what I would have done. I would have ordered a Sidecar during that time, in February, March, April of maybe 2 years ago now? 2 years ago, yeah, 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I would have ordered it and been like, what's wrong with this experience, right? It's like what we did with dinner. We interviewed people and asked them what's wrong with the experience for Sprig. One of the things is this sketchy beat up car coming up to the street, like about to pick me up. And I'm like, what is going on here, right? I don't want to get in that. And the second thing was, as soon as you get in, you're like, what do I do now? Like, this is awkward. I'm like in some stranger's car. It's not exactly a taxi, so I don't want to be too rude. It's like a regular human being. And so what they did is they broke this down and said, how do we make this a more socially accepted experience? And so that's where the pink mustache and the fist bump came from. And the very interesting thing about all of this was that John had realized, and John, not just John, I'm sure there were other people on the team who were involved in this, but they had realized that actually the service of taxis are particularly dissatisfying for women. There's a particular sense of sort of lack of safety and trust that women have getting in a cab at sort of like 1 or 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning in pick your shady neighborhood of San Francisco, right? And so one of the main criteria of the original set of, and by the way, of course, it's not like men like that either. It's just that it was a bigger impact on women. So this benefit that I'm about to describe actually applied to both sides as well, applied to the entire audience. The interesting lesson here was that, like, if we could make this something where my sort of, my 21-year-old cousin who's visiting from India could get safely into a Lyft without me ever having to be there. If I felt safe about that at 2 a.m. in the Tenderloin, that's the type of driver we want. And that's the type of environment that Lyft was trying to create. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm sure people have had bad and good experiences, but just the aspiration for that led to an outstanding customer experience, and has a lot to do with sort of understanding the psychology of customers. Next slide. And this is what happened. I mean, this is Sprig. You know, this is leading up to our fundraise. There's literally no marketing here. So all of these spikes are oftentimes just things like the weather or whatever else that made the huge difference, or maybe we had a good dish that week or something like that. But for the most part, what you're seeing here is a pretty clear growth rate. But what you also notice is a lot of flat weeks, right? You have a lot of weeks where you're like, holy shit, is this really working? What are we gonna do? And the thing that I think is brilliant about what we've done so far, and certainly we have a long way to go, there's a lot of challenges, this business is by no means figured out, but what we did really well is that we said, look, we're gonna stick to our guns and stay focused. And staying focused on those things allowed us to get to here, and this is sort of the time where we raised the Series A and the time where we no longer share our numbers, but the final thing that I think is interesting, obviously, is like, look at the ratio of new customers to repeat customers, right? So the stack of people who try the service once and they just convert. So you take this, and if you took that cohort and looked at it all the way across, you'd see the same people from week 1 continuing to use it on week 12 and 15 and whatnot. So, next slide. So that's the story of Sprig and Lyft and Udemy. I hope that was helpful. Thank you. Because a lot of times when you think about startups, people think about competition as other startups, which is really not true, right? Like, sure, now, today, Lyft and Uber are serious competitors and compete every day. Eat24, Grubhub, and Seamless certainly compete, right? But in the early days, your competitors are existing markets. So the question was, you know, education, transportation, and food. You've gone into 3 big markets that have entrenched competitors. How do you deal with that? You know, that's why I enter those markets, because I feel as though the innovator's dilemma plagues most companies and most industries. And so we're able to provide a value proposition and a product in those markets that is completely different from what the current companies provide. And so the way that you beat the competition is not by, you know, Henry Ford's famous quote, this was probably more appropriate earlier, but I'll say it now, is, you know, if I asked people what they wanted, they'd say a faster horse, right? The thing about that, though, is that almost everybody out there is trying to build a faster horse. If you've ever been in a company that's larger than like 50 people, honestly, even startup companies that are bigger than 50 people or 1,000 people or whatever, it's very difficult to find a company, and certainly it'll just be a segment of the company at which they're coming up with completely new ways to disrupt themselves. So to me, it's an opportunity that companies are so big and that our market's so large, because it just means there's more to take. So co-founders at Sprig, I've now had 5 total co-founders at 2 companies. So it's always been a bit of a party at the early days. And, you know, a couple thoughts. The first thing is that I prefer for there to be a lot of really smart people in the room when doing really hard things. And so why do we have 4 co-founders? Because I didn't care about giving up equity. I cared about building the biggest possible company. And to me, that has a much higher, you know, much higher likelihood of success when you have more smart people in the room. Now, one thing that's slightly different about Sprig than Udemy is the leadership structure is more clear at Sprig, right? And so that was something that I changed. But we brought on other 2 people because we felt like we needed a customer experience guy, someone who does not just product but brand and design, and sort of like does a lot of the pink mustache and fist bumps of Sprig, right? The chocolate and that. So that's Morgan. And then we need an engineering, obviously, to build the product. So Matt, and so we met them, and in a lot of ways we just felt like that made a lot of sense. And it was the right sort of 4 people that we needed to build a big company. And one of them was my best friend. Yeah. So that was easy. It actually wasn't that easy. It was a very tough mental decision of like, emotional decision of like, am I going to go into business with my best friend, whatever. We did it. It's been great. We get along wonderfully. The other 2, we interviewed them and we did reference checks, like rigorous reference checks, and we knew what we were getting ourselves into, you know. I think that at the end of the day, it's not that different from hiring. It's just a longer process. There's a lot more drinks involved, a lot more dinners, a lot more time spent with each other before you actually build the company. And then there's a structure in place, just like any company, by which you can exit in the event that someone doesn't work out. And so that's sort of, you know, we have a vesting schedule. All four of us have vesting. If I suck as CEO, they'll fire me and they'll find someone else. And if someone doesn't work out between the three of them, then same thing will happen. And so the risk is a little bit mitigated. It's certainly not, you know, it's not no risk. It's a lot of risk if you lose a co-founder, but it's mitigated, right?